Hello guys and welcome back to the channel. My name is Sami, I'm a human nutrition student and researcher at the university. My job here is to synthesize the content I learn at the university in classes, and I summarize it and synthesize it for you in these type of videos. So today we are going to continue the public health series of videos, and today we talk about health epidemiology and demography. So let's begin. So what we're going to do today is to talk about first demography. What is demography? The concept of demography. Demography statistically studies structure and dynamics of a human population. As I said in the last video, a population is a set of people who reside in a given territory. So they share something in common. And you may ask, where do they find all this data? Where do they find all the numbers about how many people there are in a certain country or city? What is the natality, the mortality, whatever? Well, the data come from the population census, which is something here in Spain we do every 10 years. Then the partial surveys that are sent to people so they can fill them up. Then we have, of course, the civil registry that everybody needs to be on, and the continuous municipal register. So these are the main ways the epidemiology associations and demography ones study the population. And we have to differentiate between dynamic and static demography. Static demography is the demography that focuses on the size, for example, the territorial distribution or the structure by gender and age of a given population. What I'm talking about here is that these numbers do not change. They are as they are, because we will see on the dynamic demography that we will study something that is continuous and changes. Again, size of a population is how many people, for example, there are in a given territory, and how many are boys, how many are girls, and those types of numbers. Territorial distribution can be absolute or relative. Territorial distribution is where the people are actually concentrated, of course in the big cities, but how many exactly do we have there? So there is an absolute number of how many people there are in this city, and then a relative number, how many per kilometer square there are in that city. And well, this type of data, the territorial distribution, is very, very dependent on the physical state of the city, for example, the historical and the socioeconomic factors, mainly the socioeconomic factors, because if a city is cheap, probably a lot of people are going to go there to live. Do you get what I'm saying? And then we have the structure by gender and age, and these are the pyramids and demographic indicators. So maybe you have seen this. These are pyramids in which we can differentiate between male and females, and they are divided by groups of ages. The base is from 0 to 5 years old, and then 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and so on. This is a very good pyramid because it means that our society is growing and we have more natality than mortality, so our population growth is going up. This second one is when we don't have a much growth on the population. As you can see here, the natality is not that high as it was here, and it's parallel to most of the other age ranges. Again, in here the growth of the population is stuck. And then we have this type of pyramid which is regressive. That means that we have a very, very low natality rate, and there are more older people than young people. This is the actual pyramid that can be applied to Europe in general, but mostly here in Spain. On the other hand, we have the dynamic demography, and this tells us about fertility, mortality, and migration. There are a lot of indexes and types of data that can tell us about these three types of dynamic demography, but these indicators, what they all three do together, they tell us about the population growth right now and the life expectancy. The difference is that with these ones, they are static. We see how things went. With these three, we see how things are going. Do you see the difference? I don't know if you see, but there is an equation here. If we put these three types of indicators in an equation, then we will get the population growth. And the population growth will also reflect the life expectancy of that area. Moving on, now we talk about epidemiology. Epidemiology is a science, so it follows the scientific method, which is to observe, to make questions, create hypotheses, do experiments, find some results, and then create some conclusions about those results. And this is the epidemiological method, which is a scientific method applied to epidemiology. There are three types of epidemiology. We have descriptive, analytical, and experimental. Descriptive epidemiology is basically the one in which we tell things as they are. We only observe and we tell. And here we can have the incidence and the prevalence. Incidence is just telling the new cases we have of, for example, a disease. New cases, that's it. And the prevalence is the total cases in a given time. That means the new cases minus the cases that have been through the disease and now they are healthy again. Analytical epidemiology is the one that observes, like in the descriptive, but it also creates an analysis on that data. And it tries to find markers, cause-effect, by observing. For example, it would be, okay, so we have new cases. Why? What do those new cases share between them? Why do they suddenly have the same type of disease? This is the analytical one. And then we have the experimental, in which we have an intervention. We make an intervention. So, for example, we have seen that, and then with the analytical, we say, okay, so what do they share? We find something that can be a marker of cause-effect, and then with the experimental, we say, so try to avoid doing that thing, and then we experiment, and we see if there are some changes. Of course, here we are talking on a population level. Then, if we talk about epidemiology, we cannot skip this part. Correlation and causality. This thing is very, very important to understand. They are not the same, even though they are similar. Correlation does not imply causality. And I will make an example so you can understand this better. So they say there is a correlation between eating saturated fat and having cardiovascular diseases. Does that mean that saturated fat equals cardiovascular diseases? No, because it is a correlation and not a causality. Because here's the thing, maybe those people that do not consume saturated fats are also the people that exercise more and sleep better, and they do not stress. So as you can see, there are more factors that can play in this game, and that's a correlation, not a causality. So now that we know that correlation and causality are not the same, we must understand what risks are. We have the risk factor, the risk marker, and the risk indicator. The first one is the one we can control. For example, we know that smoking is not that good, and this is a risk factor for cardiovascular diseases, and we must avoid that. This is something we can control. A risk marker, though, is something we have no control on. And that's when, for example, we get older and our age is something we cannot control really, but is a risk marker because being older can lead to more diseases. And then we have the risk indicator. And this is something that tells us directly that we have a disease or we are going to have one. So a positive association means a risk. A negative association is a protection. And we have variables. Variables to determine this are nominal, which is yes or no. This is, for example, when you ask a person, do you smoke? It's a nominal, yes or no. An ordinal is how much do you smoke? Like little, a bit, a lot. And then we have the categoric one, which is exactly how much. Do you fall between 5 to 10 cigarettes a day or from 10 to 15? Whatever. These variables are used for creating correlation and causality in a given study. And then we have the cause-effect factors that I put here because they are near the analytical epidemiology. And the cause-effect factors are predisposing, facilitating, triggering, and potential factors. Predisposing is something that you are prone to have. Facilitating is something that will ease you to contract that disease. Triggering is something that if you have it, then you will get the disease for sure. And potential is something that it can maybe or maybe not. And then we have the epidemiology measures. These are the ways in which we can measure what happens in a population. So when we have a sample of a population, it can be probabilistic, in which we have control and we select exactly what we want for the study, or not probabilistic, in which we have no control and we do the study with what we have. So there are three types of measures here. The frequency measures are incidence and prevalence, and we talked about this before. Frequency measures say how many new cases or whatever we want to study there are, how many. Effect measures, they tell us how something is done, how is the relative risk and the odds ratio, and then the absolute how. And then we have the impact measures that it tells us how much, the potential impact that something can have on a given population. So now that we know what epidemiology is, which is a science, we need to design strategies for our own study to follow the scientific method. And we have two types of investigation. The quantity investigation, which has an external validity, is something in a big scale, big scale. For example, a country study, or the 7 countries study, or the Framingham study. Those are very big groups in which we investigate. And the validity is given by someone else. On the other hand, we have the quality investigation, which is a small group of people, for example, and the validity is internal, because I do the study and I can validate if it is with a proper result or not. By following this little diagram, we're going to view all the types of studies we can find and follow. Intervention? No. So it's an observational study. Does it make comparison? No. Descriptive studies. Descriptive studies. Oh, look! Descriptive type of epidemiology. Descriptive studies are, for example, ecological studies. And these are group studies. And they follow everything that happens to a group. And they only describe that, what happens to the group. Then we have the case series. And these tell how things happen in the group studied. And then the transverse studies. And they tell us what happens at a certain time. So if we block everything, boom, right now, what do we have? If we though make a comparison, we have analytical studies. Analytical, sampling, disease or exposure. Are you going to focus on disease? Okay, so we have case control studies. Case controls are basically two groups. One is the case in which we have sick people, and the control in which we have healthy people. And these two groups have individuals that have pairs. So one here has a pair, another person that corresponds to him right there. And by doing that, we can make a frequency comparison by pairing, and this is the key, because we have the case and the control group. On the other hand, if we focus on exposure, we have the cohort studies. They are a representative group of the entire population. The cohort is basically when you select different types of people that can represent the entire population. Imagine stereotypes of the population and grab one of each. That's how you remember these cohort studies. Getting back here, intervention. Now we do intervene. So yes, experimental studies. These are meant to demonstrate and quantify the efficacy and safety of a new procedure. We differentiate between only intervention and intervention and random and control. Only intervention, we have uncontrolled clinical trials, which is meant to patients, the quasi-experimental studies, and this is called quasi because it lacks one of the requisites. So it lacks one of the requisites, that means that it lacks either control, randomness, but it can't lack the intervention though. And then we have, on the other hand, the intervention and random and control. So here we have control but randomness as well. So this is the randomized controlled clinical trial. Uncontrolled clinical trial, randomized controlled clinical trial. So this is the study with the most evidence of them all. Yes, because you have to know that all these studies right here, they go from the least to the most evidence, like that. And moving on, we have errors and replicability. Yes, because you have to know that scientific studies may have errors, and they do need to be replicable to be considered a scientific study. So let's begin with errors and biases. There is a significant difference between an error and a bias. A bias is a systematic error. An error is something that we have been done wrong and we got wrong results. But a bias is something we have been doing good, but because of what we used for the study, we got a different result, let's say, because here is a graphical representation of what a bias is, a systematic error. So you're doing great because you're getting all the dots on the same spot, so it works. I mean, the machinery works, but is not accurate because those dots should be really here. Do you get this point? There are three types of biases. The selection bias is when you have a non-representative sample. The information bias is when you have been doing pool measurements. And this is also the memory or interviewer bias. For example, if we ask questions to someone, maybe the memory of that person is not that accurate. For example, in talking about nutrition, what have you been eating in the last couple of days? And the person doesn't really remember everything. So that's a memory bias. Or the interviewer bias also, because maybe the person remembers something, but then the problem is from the interviewer, because the interviewer understand different things. So there's a lack of communication, poor measurements. And then we have the analysis bias. This is not counting the third variables. And these variables can be a confounding variable that confuses when we are trying to make an analysis, or an effect modifier variable. This is when we have something that will eventually change the results that we have. Moving on, we have replicability and validity of a study. we have the intra-observer replicability and the inter-observer's replicability. Intra-observer, that means that you can replicate what you have been doing by yourself. And inter-observers, that another person can replicate what I am doing. And then we have validity. We were talking about validity before, and when we said that internal validity and external validity, well, this is to make it even clearer. Internal validity is for a study group, and I can say I succeed, I can say I got this result because I have done my study, my quality study. External validity is for the population, results applicable to the population. And validity also lead us to sensitivity and specificity. These two words are very tricky because they are similar, but they are not. Sensitivity is focusing on sick individuals, whereas specificity is focusing on healthy individuals. Imagine if we are looking at a very specific type of virus, so the sensitivity would be something like if it can detect or not that variant of the virus, whereas the specificity would be if it can detect only that and not something that is similar to that virus. This is the difference between these two. Okay, so that's it for this video. I know it has been very long and we covered a lot of things, but just to recap with you, what is demography, the science of epidemiology, how to design strategies and studies, and the errors and replicability of those studies. I hope you understood everything I said. If you have any doubt, there is a comment section down below. Remember to like, subscribe and share this video to your friends so they can also know what are the health epidemiology and demography all about. You can find this diagram on my website. If you click on the first link in the description below, it will get you there. You can download it and study it for free. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one. Ciao!